Hey everyone, welcome to your favorite podcast hosted by your favorite primas. My name is Andrea and I am joined by my co-host who is also my prima.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jack, and you're listening to our podcast, Ponle Acento.
So this is exciting, prima. We had this idea in our mind in early November of last year, but it was interesting because both of us had the same idea of initiating a podcast way before that. And it's funny because I was at work and I had just attended like a professional development, like podcast lesson that they were showing at work that was like optional to go. And I was really motivated. And I said, well, there could only be one person that I know that would keep me accountable, that would match the energy that I am trying to give. And that was you. So I gave you a call and you answered. And thank you for answering it because it was pretty exciting to hear that you also had those same goals set aligned with the vision that I think is very much needed.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was so enlightened when I heard your idea. And it's so interesting. We have so many things in common. And I was also very honored for you to give me the call. And many will hear throughout the podcast how much I see you as one of my big role models here as one of my older primas. So I'm really excited to be here, and I hope everybody can be able to enjoy the podcast.
Thank you so much for your kind words. I also always learned so much from you. So I love this. This is going to be a learning space for everyone, including you and I, and hopefully for all of our listeners. When we initiated this planning session, we thought, well, the best thing that we can do for this podcast to ensure that the people that we want to reach is by asking them, right? And so we went on this journey of beginning to ask these different questions, right? About who our audience was, right? Are you an oldest sibling, a middle sibling, a younger sibling? And we asked questions about like, how do you stay connected to your culture? Do you identify more with the country of origin of your parents or your country of origin, right? We had all of these questions. And in doing that, we learned so much from our followers. And I love that. And we saw that we have so much in common. But I think now it's a time for us to kind of show our listeners who we are, right? Because we ask them, who are you? So it's only fair if we also lead by example. So who are we? Do you want to go ahead and start us off, Jack? Who are you?
Yeah, of course. So, first of all, mi nombre es Jacqueline, but I go by Jack. And I was raised by a single mom. And at the age of 8, I became an older sister. So, at a very young age, I matured very quickly and I became very responsible, given that my mom was at the time a farm worker and she was working out in the fields. She's always been working in agriculture. So, I've always tried to lead by example and making sure that she had less stress dealing with her kids. And so before that too, though, my mom, when she immigrated, she came with her brother, and her brother was like a father figure to me. So that has never um, been something that I am missing in my life. Thankfully, he took on that role, and he actually has 3 daughters. And given that one was 2 years older than me and we grew up together, I consider her my older sister. I consider all of them my sisters. It's a very beautiful relationship. And some of our Instagram followers may have seen that I introduced myself as the oldest middle child. And that is because when I'm with my mother, I am the oldest child at home. However, when I'm with my dad, I'm able to take that responsibility off and be with my older sister, get advice from her. It's really beautiful, and it's really helped me along my educational trajectory, but also within my career. And it's a beautiful thing to be able to have my older sister. I know it's really hard when I'm home and I am the oldest. Being the older sister, it has a lot of mental toll at times. So I'm really grateful for her. And I just want to give out a big shout out to my sister, first of all. Um, and so, yeah, that was my upbringing with my family. It's very unique, but at the same time, it's a very beautiful thing. And I always whenever I get homesick, I always think, yes, it is sad. However, it's also, I think, indicative of what a beautiful family I come from and what a happy household I come from. So that's a little bit about me and my upbringing. But as far as my education, I was very fortunate enough to graduate from UCLA, first in the family to do so. And I was also the first in my family to actually leave the household. So that came with a lot. Um, I would say with a lot of, again, mental toll, but we were able to persevere. And thankfully, I got a double major in Chicanx and Central American Studies. And then I also majored in labor studies. I recently was in New York completing some graduate studies. I'll probably share more about that later, but I do have that background as well. And again, very painful to be the first one to actually leave out of state. It was really an interesting experience, but I don't regret it. And I always encourage people to venture out, build their community outside, and leave the bubble. But that's a little bit about me, and I'm really excited to continue to share more about my story throughout this project.
I love that. I love that you share your vulnerability, Jack, about how difficult it is to be the
Mhm.
first one. And I think that a lot of our listeners are really put in that position because when you're a child of immigrants, whether you're the firstborn or, the middle, third, fourth sibling, you're still first generation, right? And so what does that
Mhm.
mean? And how do we navigate those pressures? And, because
Mhm.
they are there. And also, how do we honor, what we want for ourselves, but also how do we make sure that we are still there for our family? And I think that that's
Mhm.
something that is really difficult to navigate. And I think that a lot of our listeners are probably in that position. So I appreciate you sharing that with the rest of our listeners and with me. And so I guess I will introduce myself next. My name is Andrea, and I am the middle child of two immigrant parents. I grew up in the Central Valley of California, and my parents were always working either in factories, canneries, in the fields. And so they always had very different work schedules because, they still needed to take care of their three daughters. And so usually my mom would work in the morning and my dad would work in the evening or the night shift because that is just how it worked, right? That's how they made it work. And so, really, for me, growing up, I was surrounded by family, really close knit family through my dad's side and through my mom's side as well. I just knew the importance of being connected to my culture because I grew up learning how to speak Spanish. And it wasn't until I was about 3 or 4 years old when I came to the realization of I almost like to say it was like the first time like I questioned the world. I actually participated in a strike with my dad. I was about 3.5 years old. And my dad was working at a factory that was practicing unfair labor laws. And so him and the rest of his colleagues went on strike. And so I was on my dad's shoulders, at the picket line. And, I was screaming huelga because according to my parents, I learned how to speak before I learned how to walk. So there was 3-year-old Andrea screaming huelga on my dad's shoulders. And so I think that was my first realization of like, like what is happening here? This doesn't seem right. I also particularly remember that day because my dad, on our way back home, I really needed to use the restroom. But after 2 or 3 hours of being a community activist at the
Mhm.
small age of 3.5, I really, really, really needed to use the restroom. And so my dad got nervous and he pulled over to the red to like take me to go use the restroom. Well, because it was a strike and there was a lot of law enforcement, they ended up pulling him over um, and giving him a ticket. So my dad does not let me live that one down. And to make matters worse, not only did my dad get a ticket, but I also peed my pants. So that was kind of like the initial
Mhm.
I guess the first time that I really kind of navigated like what it was like to bring a community together, and what it
Mhm.
was like to advocate at a very, very young age. Um, but I think that need for advocacy kind of followed me through middle school and high school. And I did a lot of volunteer work. I've always done the translation and the interpretation for my immediate family and my extended family. And so I think that a need and that drive for service definitely came from my family and our culture. And it's still very much ingrained, so much so that I work at a public university today. And tasks is to make sure that our students become great global citizens through community engagement and through leadership. I am a first generation like you, Prima. My parents never finished high school or even elementary school for that matter. And so I navigated high school, I navigated college, I navigated grad school kind of on my own, um, al- along with some mentors, right? Because it's important to understand that mentors come along in that way. Um, but yeah, that's a little bit about who I am. And again, I thank you, Prima, for sharing who you are and then for our listeners of who you are
Mhm.
through our Instagram. And, please follow us along because we'll continue to make sure that we have interactive polls and questions on our Instagram so that we can continue to make our episodes informed based on our listeners. So, Jack, one of the questions that you asked as we were trying to figure out who are our listeners, what do they need from us, right? One of the questions that we asked was, how do you stay connected to your culture, right? How do you ensure that everything that you learned in your upbringing is still, being honored as an adult so that it doesn't get lost in translation? So, how do you do that?
Yeah. So the ways that I've done is for me, Spanish is really important. A lot of our community members only speak Spanish. So for me, it's become really essential to use this privilege of mine of being bilingual. And I always love being able to work with my community because it makes me feel at home. For the viewers who are listening who don't know this about me, I was living in LA for about 7 years. And so being away from home, I had to find all of these different ways to stay connected. I obviously would miss my family. We come from a very big family. So for me, being able to use my language and having these jobs, these positions where I'm able to help my community has been really big and really grounded for me. Apart from my language, I would say that food is my number one because we have relatives who, for example, are tired of frijoles. They grew up in it. Our family obviously was very big. They grew up low income, so for them, right, like there was these foods that were just the cheapest and that were always there. And so for me, I somehow have the ability to just love everything. I can go a whole week eating frijoles, and so for me, food is really important. I know my brother is right now expanding his palate. And for me, I always say, enchiladas. Enchiladas are fine with me. Tacos, vamos a agarrar tacos. And he's just like, I literally had that like last week with my mom. I'm here to visit you in LA and I want ramen. So food for me has just been my go-to. And lastly, I think music. Music is really important for me. Looking at like generations after us, I realize that some of our cousins, rather English music, which is totally okay. But for me, that is um, just really calming because we listen to it not only at home when, estamos limpiando, when we're in our señora vibes and just like,
Yes.
grooming, washing the dishes, but also at our parties when we're all together in our quinceañeras, the weddings, it's the same music over again. But it's such a beautiful thing to know that everybody knows the same song, right? It's really, really, um, again, very grounding and I really enjoy it. And actually, one thing that comes to mind is a while back, I don't know if you remember this, Prima, but I remember you sharing with me how you were in a meeting once, and for you, you began to write in Spanish.
Hmm.
I totally forgot the context, so if you want to share about it, but I just remember you mentioning how for you, writing in Spanish was very powerful in that moment. So for me, whenever I was in grad school and I just felt I was lonely, I was the only Latina in my program, I took my power back and I began to write my notes in Spanish. Um, and that for me in that moment, being in this very, elite institution, was very powerful. And not only that, but also me walking to class, I would blast my Mexican playlist.
Hmm.
And I would just take back my power of, I am here, I belong here. Um, so those are some of the things that keep me within my culture, besides translating all the time, which I do, almost on a daily basis. So, those are some of the things that keep me within my culture. I'm also very politically aware, so I try to also stay involved with politics in Mexico just so that I'm able to help family who is over there. So that's how I keep connected with my Mexican culture. What about you, Prima?
I love it. I love it. And yeah, I had forgotten that I had shared that like anecdote with you.
Mhm.
Yeah, when I was an undergrad student, I studied political science and international relations. I actually got an opportunity to um, intern for a congressman up in Sacramento. And so, again, one of those things of like being the first, which totally reminded me as I was hearing you tell that story, was that I had to, coming from the Central Valley, we have one freeway, right? And one freeway only, right? The 99 South or the 99 North. Well, in
Mhm.
Sacramento, that just seemed like the biggest like puzzle for me because there's like so many freeways and highways and I was just so scared of like if I take the wrong freeway, like I'm done, I'm toast. And so my internship was at a different city that was not Sacramento, but it was a nearby city. And again, because I had never, I was the first one, and my parents had never
Mhm.
navigated this either. I remember, I'm going to age myself here a little bit. I am 30, so I am a millennial. And so I had a phone my first year of college, but that phone did not have internet because we just could not afford it as part of the plan. Um, but also, I would just go in to MapQuest and I would print out my addresses to get to where I needed to get to. And so I remember driving from Sacramento to this other city to go do my internship, to go do my interview and everything. And I just remember like memorizing the MapQuest so that I wouldn't like put anyone's life in danger driving, like trying to rain. Um, but I remember that it would have taken me like 15 minutes to get there if I had taken the freeway. But again, I was like terrified of getting on the freeway. So I ended up taking like all the different like back roads and the lights just so that I would avoid the freeway. And it took me 45 minutes to get there. Eventually, I did get the courage to take the freeway. But I was also just 18 years old. And, when that story comes from, being in the position of, taking down notes and feeling like everyone was like looking at me. And that imposter syndrome was like, you know, it was just pretty intense. And so writing Spanish for me, that was a piece where I don't know, it made me feel better because it made me feel like an individuals around me couldn't read what I was saying, so therefore they couldn't criticize it. But also it gave me power to know like, well, I can write whatever I want and you're not going to understand what it's saying. I was started
Mhm.
writing like really sloppy cursive too, but that is another story on its own. But yeah, I think that the way that I stay connected to my culture is also, speaking Spanish. Right now, I am part of the language accessibility committee at the higher institution that I work at. And it focuses on language justice. And so, again, just looking for ways to continue to speak Spanish. And anytime that I'm given the opportunity at work to be able to do a presentation in Spanish, I will do it. And, sometimes it is a little bit challenging because there's certain terms that are so easy to say in English because now it's natural that now you have to like learn how to say in Spanish. And I think just last week I was trying to say like bridging the gap, but in Spanish. And I was like, hey, how do you say bridging the gap? Like, llenar el hueco? And so and so that's one thing. Another thing that I'm like a firm believer of is that I know that there's a saying that'll actually be our next episode about, that generational trauma, it gets passed down. But I'm also a firm believer that generational wisdom gets passed down. And I make sure that all of those little remedies that were taught to us, I continue to do, right? So all the different tés, all the different, whenever I'm sick, me pongo vapuro en las plantas de los pies. Like if I'm feeling a little bit tight around my shoulders, I do the ventosas. And so I think for me, that is one of the ways in which I honor the wisdom that came before us. They work. If not, we would have stopped doing it, right? And so really those are some of the some of the ways that I stay connected to my culture, along with everything that you said too, right? And then the last one that I want to say that I don't know if it's just me. I don't think it's just me, but it might sound weird if it is just me. This is a safe space, so I'm going to say it anyway. I go to church and I do all of my prayers in Spanish. Like if you ask me to do a
100%.
prayer in English, I don't speak English prayer. I only speak Spanish prayer.
Yep. Yeah, no, I can completely agree with that sentiment. In LA, I would be going to the church, always Spanish mass.
Yeah.
Always, 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 because it was where our community was at. Every Sunday, I knew they were going to be there. I went to join, and again, prayers always in Spanish. If you ask us to do it in English, I will say it, after you, I will repeat after you. But as far as me praying on my own, it will be in Spanish.
Yeah, same. There have been times where, like, for whatever reason, like, I'll go to church in English, and like the moment that they start, saying like El Padre Nuestro, like I'll just say it in Spanish. And I've gone plenty of times where I could probably at this point learn it in English. But I'm like, no,
Yeah,
church is
no.
only
At
done in
UCLA,
Spanish. Go ahead.
yeah, absolutely. At UCLA, given that it was a lot of students there, obviously we all spoke English. I would attend occasionally in English, but my Padre Nuestro always in Spanish. And there did come a time where I learned it in English, but I mean, I left afterwards, or I graduated afterwards, so it just like left me because it just didn't feel,
Yes.
like we grew up in the Spanish one, so I'm sure it's out of my mind by now.
I love it. I love it. Uh, Well,
Yeah.
that's a little bit about how I stay connected to my culture, and I appreciate you sharing the ways that you do the same. So I wonder what our listeners will think, if they will too, like, be nodding their heads when they hear this. So I look forward to that feedback. All right. So as we kind of began to think about what we wanted this podcast to do, we asked those questions, right? Such as the one that we just talked about. But we were also trying to center ourselves in our mission and the vision of our podcast, Jack, right? So what did we want this to be? And in order for us to do that, we really had to think about our why. Like, why did we want there to be a space for two Latinx individuals to come in and build this community? Like, what were our whys? What was your why?
Well, I think my why was just growing up and being in school and having all these guest speakers. First of all, a lot of them weren't really, they didn't have the similar upbringing that I had. Being a child of immigrants comes with a lot of responsibility. And when we go off to college, those who choose that pathway and are able to have the means to go, whether we use our financial aid, some of us take out our loans to be able to complete this dream of ours. We end up going to college and now we have imposter syndrome. So first it was our upbringing that brought a lot of sadness at times, a lot of difficulty. And now we get into a space where we've earned our space and we worked really hard for it. And now we're again feeling alone, and now we don't know what to do. And then we shift into a space where we're now working. But sometimes at work, right, maybe we're the only Latinos there, the only Latinas, and it's really hard to navigate the space. I personally, when I was working in study abroad, I oftentimes felt really odd when I was helping these students where, I would try to make sure I would give them all the information. I would ask, do you need, more information about financial aid and how this relates? No, their parents were paying for it. And I was just there like, what a privilege. It just felt really, despite me being the advisor and me being, the adult here, I just felt really, really odd about it at times. And so, for me personally, I was thinking like there's all these spaces that we're always in. We're a big population, and we actually wanted to share some facts with our listeners. That according to Pew Research, 63% of Latinx are categorized as first generation. So we're actually a really big population, and yet there aren't these spaces for us. We were also talking about how we were trying to find similar podcasts so that we could, see what they were talking about. We didn't want to mimic them, but we couldn't find any. That wasn't like chisme based, right? Or that wasn't talking about like the current chisme, or other experiences, but they weren't centered on being Latinx, or sorry, first generation, being the first. So for us, this was really a crucial point, I think. And even then, according to like Excellence in Education, for example, which promotes Latinx students' achievement, and they conduct analysis to inform these educational policies that affect us, Latinos are more likely to be first-generation college students than any other racial and ethnic group. So again, we are growing, we are taking space, we are here, estamos presente, and yet we don't have these spaces where we're able to connect. As you mentioned, Prima, in our Instagram, when we're asking these questions, there was so many people that were actually saying the same thing. And for us, when we were, revising all of these answers, it was really impactful to see that we had all these similar feelings that, again, we all have similar experiences, and yet no one talks about it. And I hope this is a really healing opportunity for people to listen in and know that whatever they feel, we most likely also feel it too. And again, there's a big comunidad of us out there. We're breaking barriers. We're, breaking the glass ceiling. So that was initially, part of the reason why I was so excited to join this project. And I hope that this is also a healing and safe space for everybody else who listens. And I really genuinely hope that it opens more conversations between relatives, between the generations, so that we're able to better understand one another and, just continue to support each other.
I love that. And that really connects to my why as well. You're right. We were looking to see like what podcast, could relate to our kind of like lived experiences. And again, there was a lot of podcasts of a lot of, Latinx individuals, but they weren't necessarily the ones that you and I were looking for. And then, we got thinking like, if we are seeking that like validation, those resources, that research-based topics, are other individuals that are in the position like we are they doing the same too, right? And so I think that why was like pretty similar to both you and I. And I'm a runner, and so I often listen to podcasts when I run. And again, a lot of the searching of like, where are conversations about imposter syndrome or fight or flight or a simulation like that I could relate to. And it was just really difficult to find. So I echo everything that you said. We want to create this space where everyone can feel included. And for those that are not part of this community, right? You are not first gen, you are not a child of immigrants, but you are an ally and an advocate, that this is something that you can now use as a resource to be able to learn how those different paths of individuals that I identify as our key audience are feeling, right? So that you can support them best. I think oftentimes we have that conversation about, if you don't know a certain community, it's always important for us to do that research because we should not be putting the burden of having to explain and educate on that individual who is already experiencing a lot of systematic oppression. And so podcast is another way in which individuals can really educate themselves without having to put the burden on somebody else. I love that. So we are here, and like my prima said, we're not going anywhere. We're just going to get stronger together. We really are. And this is a learning process for all of us, including Jack and I, and we're so excited for it. So that brings us to the end of our pilot episode, and we are so excited for you to hear our next episode, which is released on the same day, so you can go onto any platform that you listen to your podcast in and listen to our first episode because it'll already be up. Jack, if individuals want to follow us on social media or DM us, not DM us, or email us, where does one do that?
Yeah, of course. So you can follow us on Instagram at Ponle Acento Podcast. It's all together. Again, Ponle Acento Podcast. And we want to express that, again, this is a safe space for everybody. If you want to email us with ideas, something that you want to hear, you want to share a story, feel free to email us at ponleacento.podcast@gmail.com. So we hope that you take us up on this offer. And again, follow us on Instagram. We're going to be putting more polls up. We're going to be sharing some sneak peeks. So we hope you join us there. And again, if you have any feedback, we also welcome it. And again, email us at ponleacento.podcast@gmail.com.
Right on. Thank you. And for our final remarks, this podcast is brought to you by Andrea and Jack. It is co-hosted, co-produced, and co-directed by both primas, Andrea and Jack. Editing of the recorded content is done by me, Andrea, and our wonderful social media and outreach is done by Jack. Research on discussed topics is done by both primas, and sources can be found on our link tree. We aim to make our platform nonpartisan. In the case of an opinion being expressed by either, those opinions belong solely to the person who expressed that opinion. For accessibility features on the podcast, please visit our YouTube channel for captions and script of the episode. And just like that, we are all done with our pilot. And here are some palabras de sabiduría for the week that we want to share with our listeners. So, Jack, why don't you go first?
Yes, one of the quotes that really has pushed me to become who I am today is one that our oldest tío said to me one day, and that is sin miedo al éxito. Oftentimes too, like these institutions are really scary for us. They can be unwelcoming. But I always say sin miedo al éxito y para adelante. We're here to become successful, to build this generational wealth. And, we have the courage. We already have the resilience. We have the skill set of being very resourceful. So, sin miedo al éxito, gente, we got this, and para adelante.
Thank you. For my palabras de sabiduría for the week is an affirmation. It is, I am powerful. Yo soy poderosa. Again, whenever we are navigating these two different worlds that we live in and trying to really honor who we want to be, but also honor our families and try to navigate what our cultures expect from us. It's important for us to remember that we hold power. So, Jack, tú eres poderosa. I am poderosa. And for our listeners, ustedes son poderosos o poderosas. And that is all we have for you today. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, everybody. Love A and J.